Welcome to the Over the Hump Podcast, your gateway to the world of the iconic Brahman breed of cattle. At BRC Ranch, our passion for Brahman cattle runs deep. Join us as we delve into the heart of this extraordinary breed, unveiling its rich history, exploring industry trends, and sharing captivating stories that define the American Brahman. BRC Ranch stands as the pinnacle of Brahman excellence in America, boasting a decade-long legacy of champions and housing the finest Brahman bulls worldwide. It's not just about cattle, it's about a legacy that reverberates across ranches and hearts. Brought to you by BRC Ranch, where the Brahman legacy thrives and stories are woven into the very fabric of ranching. This is Over the Hump. And now your hosts, Brendan Cottrell, Rachel Cottrell, and Keaton Dodd.
Hey everybody, and welcome to Over the Hump. In this episode, I had the pleasure of visiting with Brand Jones of Abilene, Texas. He's an avid Brahman breeder and a huge fan of crossbreeding with Brahman cattle. He's one of the most passionate advocates of the Brahman F1 female. But in this episode, he also shares a lot of historical information about pioneer breeders JT and Katie White of Hearne, Texas, which is where he got the foundation of his family's herd. We hope you enjoy it. Let's get to it. Welcome to today's episode of Over the Hump podcast. I'm your host, Rachel Cottrell, and today I am so excited to have with us Brand Jones as today's guest. So welcome, Brand.
How are you today?
Good. How are you? Where are you calling in from today?
Okay, I live in Buffalo Gap, Texas. That is about 8 miles south of Abilene. We're just kind of a continuation of Abilene out in West Texas. My wife and I both are from here. We grew up in Abilene. We're native Abilenians and have been here since, I was born in 60. She's born in 61 and high school sweethearts and raised our family here. And so it's just kind of it's not the typical story, but it's the story that used to resonate in our culture anyway. But anyway, we've been here and we have ranched and also been involved in other businesses, oil field, as well as livestock nutrition. As you know, it takes all hands on deck to make a living. And so that's what we've done.
So I am very thankful for our friendship, and in preparing for this podcast, I was kind of thinking of how to introduce you, because I think your program is what some people might call a non-traditional Brahman breeder. And I say that because you don't show cattle, but then you could also call yourself an extremely traditional Brahman breeder because you don't show,
Right.
so
Right.
I love that. And I think today I'm really looking forward to just having that conversation about the real world production of Brahman. You have been a Brahman breeder and a huge supporter of Brahman for decades now. And, you serve as an ABBA director. And so if you would just share with our listeners the story of how did Brand Jones get into the Brahman business? Let's just start off with that.
Well, I'll have to take you back to my early beginnings. My dad was raised in Southeast Texas, and he actually lived near Zavala, Texas, in Angelina County. And then when he was older, my grandmother and his mom, they all moved to near Beaumont. My grandparents had split, and so my dad was exposed to cattle in Southeast Texas, which he was born in the 30s. So in the 40s and 50s, there would have been a lot of Brahman influenced cattle. And fast forward a little bit, he went into the Air Force out of high school. In fact, he got his GED after he went into the Air Force. He fibbed about his age because he was 6'6", and so he was a very tall man and looked older than his age. So he went into the Air Force when he was 16, and through a series of events, he was transferred to Abilene, Texas, to Dyess Air Force Base, which is still a very valuable part of our defense system in the United States here in Abilene, a very big base here. And this would have been in the late 50s. And so my mother, who grew up outside of Abilene about 35 miles on our family ranch, was a school teacher here in Abilene, Texas. At that time, she had been out, I think she was in her first teaching assignment. They met and got married, and I came along, and they were transferred to California. And in the meantime, my mother was an only child, and the family ranch, which consisted of a couple of thousand acres then, there was no heir. And my grandparents came to my parents and said, look, if you will move back to West Texas and take over the ranch, it's all yours. We'll help you get started. We'll help put you in the cattle business. My mom could teach school. My dad could be basically a full-time rancher. And so he ended his career in the military in end of 1962, moved back to West Texas, back to Abilene, and thus began ranching. My grandfather, the idea of a crossbred cow to my mom's dad was a black white face, a half Hereford, half Angus. That was a crossbred cow. My dad's view of a crossbred cow, because of his time growing up in Southeast Texas, was something with some ears. Mm-hmm. And so there was a little conflict there of that. And so we were not able to fully move into raising anything with ears until unfortunately, after my grandfather passed in 1971. Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, my father was quite enamored with Brahman cross cattle, Brahman breed, what the Brahman breed could do. And so we went to beef cattle short course long time ago. And we took trade publications, and I can remember as a child, I'm talking 5, 6, 7, 8, I had a neighbor that would get Cattleman magazine, and I would get his 2-month-old Cattleman magazines that he would give me, and I would scour the pages for anything with ears. I remember seeing J. Carter Thomas's ad, J.D. Hudgens' ad, a lot of ranches that don't exist anymore, ads, and see their pictures of their cattle. And then there was that one time a year when the publication would either do a Santa Gertrudis month or Beefmaster month, or when it was really good, they do the Brahman month, and there was all these pictures of Brahman cattle, and I would wear out the pages of the Cattleman magazine looking and dreaming about having Brahman cattle, Brahman cross cattle. Okay, my grandfather, back to Southeast Texas, managed a ranch at Simonton, Texas, which is not too terribly far from you, Rachel, on the Brazos River. And he ran this ranch for a Humble Oil Company heir. And on that ranch, he had about 300 beautiful Hereford cows and J.D. Hudgens bulls. And when I was 6 years old, I can still see this vision right now. When I was 6 years old, I was sitting in the back of my grandfather's Ford pickup, and we were crossing over a cattle guard between two patches or traps where these heifers were. And we just pulled up on the cattle guard and stopped. And it looked like a sea of tiger stripe heifers came up. I'm sure there was 30 or 40 head, but it could have been 1,000 in my mind, my little 6-year-old mind. And I can remember that very moment. I still have it visualized in my brain, etched in my brain. I want that. I want to have that. And the cattle apparently were gentle because they were coming up, and I don't remember scratching on them or anything like that. But I do remember coming up to the back of the pickup. So these things etched my desire, my heart, and my brain for Brahman influenced cattle. And honestly, that was not the norm with our ranching peers and out here. I mean, they were rodeo cattle. They were crazy. We don't need those and everything. So funny how things happen. So our family physician, who had grown up in Mississippi here in Abilene, also loved Brahman cross cattle. He had Black Angus cattle. And every time I would go into his doctor's office from the time I was 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, he would always take my dad and I back, and they would talk cows. Now, here's people in the lobby coughing and spewing and all this other stuff, but he would always take time to talk to my dad and I about cows and ask my dad questions. And my dad did do a little work with him and all this. But there was a picture of this Brahman bull on the shelf in his doctor's office, and it had that JT on the side of him. It was a JT white bull. And I remember every time going to his office looking at that bull, I mean, just with just fascination, I would not quit staring at him. So fast forward to 1972 when my grandfather had passed. And so we began to make some changes at the ranch. It was determined that it would sure be nice to have to look at the possibilities of a Brahman bull. So our family physician gave us the contact information to J.T. White at Hearne, Texas, who was known far and wide as raising the gentlest Brahman cattle in the world. And so, through a series of events that revolved around a dachshund dog with a broke down back that could only get fixed at Texas A&M University small animal uh, facility, we brought the dog down, left him, and then when we went back, headed back home, my mother, my sister, and I and my dad stopped at Hearne, Texas, out on Wheelock Road, and we just showed up cold call and pulled in there, and there was Mr. JT and Miss Katie and all those cats. Hundreds of cats. I don't know how many cats they had. And
I'm totally laughing because we have an inside joke in our family. I love cats, but Brandon hates cats. But I like to tell people that he loves cats just to irritate him. So now I'm going to use that. I'm going to use that as further proof that truly great Brahman breeders embrace the love of
have
cats.
cats. Well, you can pull that one on him. So anyway, we pulled up there, and Mr. White was a very short man. Because here's my dad, 6'6", and I was 12 years old, probably a gangly 12-year-old. And so he took us, shook hands. My sister and mom went inside with Miss Katie. I don't know what they drank, coffee, tea. I'm sure she had something because they love kids, although they had no children of their own. They love kids. And so we start the tour. Now, I did not have any idea that this was the tour. I just thought we were going to go look at the man's cows. 4 hours later,
Oh
and
my
I don't know
gosh.
how big a ranch that he had, but about 400 acres, and it's all right there where he lived. But we received the grand tour, and we went out and we looked at his cow herd. And you talk about it. You couldn't have taken me to any candy store in any place in the world, pie shop, ice cream shop, and I've been any more excited than walking out in the pasture. And this was in October, so it was still pretty warm on a Saturday afternoon, as a matter of fact. And it was, I can still see it. And so he he showed us his calving barns. He showed us everything about the cattle, and there was cattle out in the pasture, and then there was some cattle there around the pens. One fascinating thing about Mr. White, there was many fascinating things, but he had served in World War I in Belgium, and during one of the doughboys during World War I. And apparently his tenure there was pretty much wrought with constant rainfall and mud. And he told us this. He said, I vowed if I ever get out of this war and get back home, I'm going to have a place where there is no mud. So he built all of his pens and barns and everything on a side of a hill and poured cement apron after cement apron after cement apron, which are still there to this day. A lot of those pens have been removed, but those old cement aprons there because he wasn't going to have himself or his cattle bog around in the mud. I
I
thought that
would.
was kind
That sounds like a dream.
of well, and now from West Texas, that's not nearly as much of a problem, but for him,
True.
obviously, in Hearne, and for you in your area, that's a little bit more of an issue.
True.
So he takes us out in his old pickup, and we go out on top of a hill. In fact, I think I sent you a picture of the live oak thicket that he had that we went up. And basically, what he was doing was interviewing us to see whether we were Brahman worthy, to be honest, or his cattle worthy.
Mm-hmm.
But we didn't know this till later on. He didn't say it in so many words. So he gets out and he does the crawling under all of them, and all of them are coming up, and I'm getting slobbered and licked on, and I could have died. I was in heaven right there. I was perfectly happy. I couldn't have told you pedigrees, numbers of cows. It did not make me any difference. I had reached the pinnacle of my life right here, surrounded by these cattle that wanted to be scratched, wallowed on, wallowed under. His litmus test for gentleness was any person had to be able to walk out into his pasture. I mean, strangers or him, it didn't make any difference, and scratch that cow behind the hock, rear hock, without her flinching. If she flinched, she was gone.
Hmm.
Now that's a pretty strenuous test,
Yeah.
but it obviously worked. So we go and we talk, and I'm sure I'm asking millions of questions. My dad was a great question asker, very curious, and we talked about grasses, and we drove around the pasture and talked about how he'd improve grasses. One of the things that he did also, Brahmins are a little bit like elephants. When they line up behind the other. So especially when you're going up to a barn or going to a barn that's kind of on the side of a hill, you create this trail that where it rains a lot becomes a ditch. So he was constantly having to redirect them, putting cross ties and things, and get them to go a different direction so they didn't wear these ditches out, which I always thought, once again, coming from West Texas where it rains 22 inches a year, that's not really a big issue for us. And but I remember that, and I thought that was fascinating. And so then this is probably getting to be 4 to 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And so he fed those cattle in the pen every day. So they would come, it'd be like, how dairy people, how the cows all go to
Mhm.
the dairy stanchions twice a day and all that. Well, it's kind of the same way. Those cows, he didn't have to call them. He didn't have to, honk the horn or do anything. They just started coming one behind the other. And they had a gate that they come in. And I kid you not, Rachel, I sat right there and watched it. The cows go in one pen, and all the calves went into the other. And I'm talking about all sizes of calves, 5 weight calves down to baby calves. They just knew where they were supposed to go. My mouth was agape. I've never seen anything like this in my life. And so anyway, that proceeded on, and here once again, I'm just like I'm beyond words, which for me is quite a problem. And but I watched that, and then he told my dad and I, after those cattle got in the pen, he shut the gate on them. He said, "Yeah, I do this every night. They make me a special feed at the co-op in Bryan, Texas, and this feed I feed them every day. And I don't know how much. He didn't give us quantities. I couldn't told you, but anyway." Then he told us something that made a lot more sense about our time together. He said, "I made up my mind when I turned 70 years old." Now, this would have been he was born in 1899, and this would have been 72. So he was 73 years old roughly at that time. He had made up his mind when he was 70 years old that I will not sell an animal to anybody I don't want to. And part of his uh, uh, screening process is he watched how you interacted with his cows. If you were nervous and jumpy, you were probably weren't a candidate. If you were fearful, even if you were a young child like myself, fearful, you weren't a candidate. Now, if you were embracing and slobbering, and they were slobbering on you and you were slobbering on them, then I'm sure I was a good candidate for that. But my dad and I both.
Mhm.
And so anyway, that concluded our first day of experience with JT White, and I was messed up. I'm 64. I'm still messed up to this day about that, and in a good way, and longed and strived to get to that some level of that same type thing. So this is October. We go back and get the dog a couple of weeks later, but we don't go by Mr. and Ms. White's house, and I had purchased some Hereford cows, Hereford heifers actually. And so the plan was I was going to raise the F1s, and my dad was going to phase them into his predominantly Black Angus cow herd. And we were just going to be, and had 20, 25 Hereford cows, so 8 or 10, 12 heifers a year. We would just phase into that. Okay. So I bought heifers. They were bred to Hereford bulls. We got the calves on the ground. So it's time for a bull. So we reached out to Mr. White. Now, I'd been anticipating this moment for a long time. And so we reached out to Mr. White, and he said, well, I only have 2 bulls here. And he said, you can come and pick. They're both, one is like 18 to 19 months old, and one was a full 2-year-old. And they were as opposite as night and day. One was tall and lanky, and the other one was kind of shorter, a little more, very moderate framed animal. So we went and looked. Both of them were equally as gentle. For some reason that day, I picked the taller one. I don't know why. I probably wouldn't do that today, but I did then. He said, let me get the bull fertility checked and everything. And he said, now, son, I used to deliver these bulls for $3,000 a piece. That was his standard price. It didn't make any difference which bull it was, just his bulls, $3,000 a piece. But he said, when I turned 70, I decided that I didn't need to be out on the road anymore. He had an old pickup, and I'd love to know where that ended up. It should be in some Hall of Fame somewhere. But it was an old pickup that had a kind of well, not sucker rod, but small, maybe like 1-inch pipe cage and a top over it. And he would walk those bulls up in there, and they would lay down, and that's how he would deliver them all over the country. Oh. He said, so since I can't deliver them for $3,000 anymore, that bull's going to be $2,500, and you come pick him up. And it was kind of interesting. I thought, $2,500 today, of course, is nothing. But I did a little work on that. And that was money out of Brand's pocket, out of my pocket, out of a little boy's pocket, or teenage boy at that time, I guess, pocket. But that $2,500 in 1973 equates to $17,365 today. That's a pretty expensive bull.
Yes, you just bought the high-selling bull in Houston.
But anyway, we bought the bull and loaded it. He called us back. We went down there, picked him up. Proudest day of my life. I'm telling you, except maybe the birth of my own children, the proudest day of my life. And put the bull in the trailer, and we were getting ready to leave. He said, now, son, I'm going to tell you something. He says, when you get home, you're going to turn that bull out, and he's going to go to the brush, and he's going to stay a week. And when he does, he don't worry about him. He's fine. He'll be fine. He'll stay a week, and then you'll see him with the cows. And I thought, that's the craziest thing I've ever heard of. So we backed up to where the cattle were. There was cows, I think, in heat. There was calves old enough to be in heat. I thought, I'm sure that he is going to tell this old man doesn't know anything about cattle in West Texas. And sure enough, we unloaded him. All of the Hereford cows run up, start smelling of him, everything else. He walks through them, completely ignores them, and found a brushy spot over in it. They were all in a 40-acre wheat field or oat field at that time. Found a brushy spot, laid down, and did exactly what the old gentleman said he would do. Stay there a week, and all of a sudden, he's with the cows. It was crazy. But anyway, that was my initial draw to JT White and my initial experience and it's the only bull I ever bought from Mr. White.
So, oh my gosh, all of those, there's so many parts to that story that I just want to ask more questions about. The first thing I realized is that I have something in common with Mr. White, because I don't like to sell animals to people that I don't like either. So I will not do
I understand.
The first thing I guess I noticed is when you were talking about that picture on the wall in your doctor's office, is how just little things like that we as Brahman breeders can do, and maybe not realize that, that it's not a big thing, but the little things like that can promote our breed so much. I mean, think of the people that probably saw that picture, I have some friends, the Santa Cruzes, they have a Mexican restaurant in Victoria. And when you first walk into the restaurant, they have a picture of their Brahman bull in there too. And you just think about how many people see that and the impact that just our little things like that can have on promoting our breed.
Right.
Amazing.
Well, Rachel, one of the things and I didn't really get into this too much because this wasn't specific to Mr. White, but in my passion and zeal to see anything Brahman, the West Texas Fair and Rodeo had an open Brahman show. In fact, my daughter showed the last time in that show in 1989 as a 7-year-old. And we only had 2 show heifers, and that was one. And she was actually out of a JT White cow, the heifer that we showed, which is kind of interesting. But anyway, uh, but I do remember J Custom Fitters, John Joyce, would come up here. JDH would come up here. Of course, JDH always had an Abilene Christian, I guess, because of Coleman Locke or whatever. There was or Mr. Leon Locke, Mr. Locke Senior. There was a connection with Abilene Christian University, and then, of course, Colors, Ed, Judd went to school there. And so there was always kind of a draw to bring cattle. So I would go out there, and of course, the open Brahman show, it went through seasons here. It was big and little and all that. But I just go out there and I can remember John Joyce actually took the time to visit with my dad, and I guess he was probably working primarily a lot of cattle for Seaberg Ranch at that time, if I recall. And I mean, these are names that most Brahman readers now don't know, but John was. I will say this about John, and I knew him later on, and all that after that period of my life, actually when I was an adult and raising Brahman cattle. But John was extremely gracious to explain the cattle and not so much the pedigrees and the things that as it related to this champion and that champion and all this stuff, but just about the cattle in general. I guess because he sensed that we were lacking lots of knowledge, and then assuming coming to West Texas there wasn't a lot of background, so it's kind of like you got to reinvent the wheel again. And I recall, that has been one thing that I have remembered when I start talking about Brahman cattle. I don't start throwing around, pedigrees, EPDs, and all this stuff. I talk about the cattle and the uniqueness of them, and to me that's what intrigued me and still intrigues me today. I mean, there's no cow that smells like a Brahman cow smells. There's no cow or beef animal, bovine, that sounds like a Brahman cow sounds or a Brahman bull sounds. And I mean, it is unique. And we take that for granted because we walk out in the pasture and we hear the grunts all the time, but that's not normal. And so people ask. I know one time my daughter was showing a heifer at our local school here, the same heifer. And the guy, who was an Angus guy and kind of an arrogant Angus guy, said, "Oh, I didn't know we were showing camels here today."
Oh gosh.
and I, and he's an old crusty fart. And actually, his grandson and my daughter went to school together, and his grandson is a show person and has Brahman cross now in their American breeds cross type stuff now. So I find that kind of interesting. And of course, the old granddad's all way passed on. But anyway, but the uniqueness of who they are, what they are, their personalities, and all of that. They're cows. And they're not people, and you don't get attached to them. My grandparents were my granddad and my dad were very good at teaching me. You love them, you take care of them. This is all kinds of cattle. You love them, you nurture them, you take care of them, but they're cows, and you do not let emotions make decisions for you that may not be in your economic best interest. And I've hauled some cows to Lone Star beef packers that we raised as babies that were 15 years old, 16, 17 years old. It's kind of a tough day. But at the end of the day, that you have to make that decision, and that has to be done. And that's hard. And I've probably hardened my heart on that some over the years. But there are times when it does come home. I thought, good gosh, we've been down a lot of roads together, sister. And looking at some cows. And so anyway, but having exhibitions in places, and you mentioned this with Jim when he was talking about being out in Sacramento or out in California. I think that's something that we really do need to think about as the Brahman breed as such. We need to not just stay in the wheelhouse, if you will, of the Brahman world, but we need to expand out a little bit. If we truly want to expand the footprint of Brahman cattle, we have got to go places where Brahmins are not common. And don't assume that they hate us or don't like us. They don't know us. And last year, and I don't know whether you saw this or not, but the Brahman Bucks program that we're doing through the marketing committee of the Brahman Association, we were at Lou Thompson's sale last September. And that's the first time we did the Brahman Bucks event. And Lou has been very, very supportive and encouraging on that. But there was a gentleman there from South Dakota.
Wow.
He lives 40 miles north of the Nebraska state line. And he was saying he bought a load of F1 cows to go to South Dakota because it has gotten so hot in the summertime that the cows, his long-haired cows or short-eared long-haired cows, are going and spending so much time in the ponds or tanks, whatever you want to call them, that it's actually retarding the weaning weights on their calves. And so he was willing to spend a significant amount of money, $70,000 or $80,000 plus freight, or whatever it costs to buy 30, 35, 40 cows and haul them to South Dakota, to give it a try and to change his calving intervals in order to try to do what we can do. And I think that's the beauty of the Brahman cow. They can be adapted in a lot of places that we assume they can't. I heard the same thing about it here. All in Brahman cattle, they can't survive in West Texas. Well, that's just not true. I mean, I've had great success with them here, and so Steve Wilkins out of Ozona, he's further out than I am.
Mm-hmm.
Brahman cattle will survive in this part of the world. It's just you got to expose them and give them opportunities to do what they can do.
When it comes to breeding your Brahman show heifers, you can trust BRC Ranch to provide high-quality bulls at great prices. Make the most of calving your first calf heifers with low birth weight bulls from BRC Ranch, like Boomtown, Peanut, Aggie, Swing Wide, and more. All priced from $50 to $100 per straw. We even offer sexed semen to help you produce your next show heifer. Go online to shopbrcottrere.com to order online, or check out our semen sales at Bovine Elite. BRC Ranch is your top choice for great Brahman semen in the United States and around the world.
So I want to go back to those JT White cattle.
Yes.
If we can revisit that, in just doing so, the JT White herd, for maybe people who are not familiar with it, their prefix was JTW, and I know, like, I've seen some animals in pedigrees that are like Didor Furno JTW. Looks like he used a lot of Imperator. What did those cattle look like from a visual standpoint? Like size, muscling, color?
They would have predominantly most of Mr. White's cattle would have been pretty white.
Okay.
Honestly, I don't recall seeing any split noses or even beginnings of split noses on them. He had a lot of Imperator genetics. He had bought a JT White Jack Manso something other. He had the bull's head in the garage, and mounted and everything. That was kind of his feature bull.
Mm-hmm.
And that was out of a Hudgens bull, I think. Edgar Hudgens and J.T. White were very good personal friends.
Okay.
And, of course, Mr. White served as president of the association. Mr. White spoke in front of the Congress of the United States.
Wow.
And I cannot find that excerpt. I would have loved to see that. But he actually got to speak in front of the Congress of the United States, and it had something to do with imports of animals, I think is what it was about. But a very, and I have gone and looked, and surely that'd be archived somewhere, and I cannot find it. But I do. In fact, it may be in that the old Brahman book. The history of the Brahman cattle that was done in the early '80s.
I know there's a picture of him in that book, but I don't.
Him and Edgar Hudgens together. Yes.
Yeah.
And but back to his cows, they would have been moderate frame. Now, I had one of those cows. In fact, she was the mother of this show heifer that my daughter had. My God, that cow weighs 1,600 pounds, 1,700 pounds. She was huge.
Mm-hmm.
And now I will say this about Mr. White's cows. Because they were so gentle, and when those calves when those cows would get heavy, he would put them. He had 3 calving stalls, and I mean these were like enclosed. Well, they weren't padded rooms, and he had hay in there. And he would put those cows in the stall, and him and 2 or 3 cats would sit in there, and he had an old chair that he leaned up in the corner, and he'd wait for that calf to start coming. And he wanted the first sound of that calf heard was the sound of his voice. And I've that fascinates me. And
That's what they call that imprinting now. I mean, but
absolutely. Well, and
he
then
was,
to take it to another level, the sheep know the sound of the shepherd's
yeah,
voice. I just love that part,
yeah.
And and so he wanted that to imprint. And he said, there's a lot of times I'd be messier than the calf or the cow by the time I got them delivered. And it wasn't they were having a problem delivery. That wasn't really it. He just wanted to be very involved in the imprinting process of that and making sure those calves knew who he was. And he would get those cows plugged in. Well, some of those cows, the teats on some of those JT White cows were not what I would consider today manageable teats for my operation.
Okay.
But because they were so gentle, he could stand right there and plug those calves in, even if those teats might be a little large, and rub on the back of the tail end of the calf to get him like he's being licked,
Mm-hmm.
and get that nurse. The cow would never do anything. And so, consequently, some of the udders over the years might not have been as good as they could have been. I know John Jeffcoat used a 449, JT White 449 bull to create a lot of his early on pedigrees. I think JJ Dieter 389 was out of that. I actually bought a bull from another gentleman that was out of it was a 449 son. He was a Jeffcoat bull 394. The same calf crop is 389, and I used that bull for a long time. We called him JJ, and had that same gentleness, just like all of Mr. White's cattle. And I think that was Johnny, and Johnny's intrigue with Mr. White's cattle too was just the gentleness.
So
And
I've looked them up, and their membership is ABBA number 177. They're that old.
how about
That
that?
is so old. Gosh, when you said that about standing there and scratching the calf, like to make it look like it was, or make it seem like it was nursing, I'm like, that is like how I spent my entire childhood. Like
Yes.
I had my dad had me a little stool I could sit on, and
Yes.
while they were nursing the cows, and it is or nursing the calves, it is a fond memory, but really something we really need to eradicate.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's not well.
Yeah.
In this, to take it a little further, I had another job. I sold oilfield pipe for 25 years,
Mm-hmm.
and the ranch is 35 miles from where I live. And so we actually bought a house in 1990 with 2.5 acres by it and built a calving facility there. So as the cows, I had 125 registered cows that time, breeding them all to Brahman bulls.
Mm-hmm.
And so as those calves would get excuse me, as those the cows would get heavy, I would bring them in. Now, I wouldn't stand there and assist in the birthing process, but I was very quick to get them in a place where I could get those calves plugged in, get the colostrum early, and all that stuff. It's just me, and my children at that time were pretty small,
Mm-hmm.
and so now they've all helped me, and they've all seen that process, and they all understand. They're Brahma addicts too. And as you can tell, and my grandchildren who you met know, some of them they are also. And but as far as going and plugging those calves in and doing all that, it just wasn't practical.
Right.
And so therefore I did two things. One, in 1999, I shifted from using all Brahman bulls to using one Brahman bull to raise my replacement heifers, and I went Hereford bulls, horned Hereford bulls at that time. And so I was able to actually, my calving season became less stressful at that point,
Yeah.
and didn't really have to help any calves nurse, even if I had cows that were beginning to have teats that were a little more questionable than they like. And so I've learned a lot, and then now at this point in my life, I only breed Brahman bulls, all I've got. To cattle that have impeccable udders. Okay. I mean, I want, and of course, and so if you call for that, you hope that you're proliferating that, and that is a female hereditary trait.
Mm-hmm.
And so you hope you're proliferating that and maybe minimizing some of your issues later on, but it seems to be a constant thing.
Brandon and I bought a piece of property that didn't have a set of pins on it, and so we built a set of pins, And Molly was pretty young then. And I said, oh, I'm going to go on eBay and look and see if I can get her a little milking stool that she can sit with you
Uh-huh.
to nurse these calves. And Brandon looked at me and he said, no, you're not. We are not nursing any calves. So
You know,
I don't have it, but
well, and I look at the pace of your life,
yeah.
and I'm like, and thus was my pace, and not anything like
Mm-hmm.
you guys are, but it was like I just don't, as much as I understand the concept. I just don't have the time because I had to do something. Somebody said one time you can kick a cocaine habit easier than you can kick a Brahman habit. I had the Brahman habit so bad I had to have some kind of income to support my cattle
Yeah.
habit,
Well,
and to make a living. And so that was that way. So that's what ushered me into the F1 business
yeah.
somewhat. I still have the same number of cows, but I just reshuffled the deck on exactly what the makeup is of the calves I produce out of them.
So a couple more. I have two more questions about the JT White, just quick ones.
Yes,
So you said you bought the bull that was 2,500, but by today's standards that would be 17,000. So
right.
did JT White, were they like a show operation, or did they show, or do you remember? Or
Oh no, no,
no?
no.
Okay,
The only time,
okay.
the only thing I ever saw them do uh, was I think early on in the inception of the Brahman breed and everything, or their involvement, is they would. I know I saw pictures of them in Fort Worth. In fact, Joseph Klotz has got a lot of pictures that he sends occasionally to me about old newspaper articles I think his dad kept. But Mr. White would have those cattle and he'd be crawling under them like at Fort Worth. But they were exhibitions. There were no
Hmm.
shows.
Okay.
And so that would have been the only thing. And every one of his bulls was halter broke.
Hmm.
And he had one guy that made those big, huge leather halters.
Hmm.
And I don't know what those things cost, but that came with the 2,500
Oh,
and the bull,
nice.
which we never used.
Wow.
But I had it.
Hmm.
In fact, I will tell you what I did use it for. There were times later on, 10 years down the road, when I was calving cows, I used it for a halter to tie the cow while in the chute because I didn't want her to go down and choke. And so I'd use that halter when I was delivering a calf. But I never did put it on the bull.
So he was
And
basically selling halter broke bulls.
he was.
Yeah.
He was. But I mean, at the time, there was no concept of
Right.
taking those bulls
Hmm.
to a show. That
Hmm.
that wasn't his thing.
So this question, I'm going to preface by saying this might be a controversial question. It's just an opinion question.
Okay. All right.
But in the concept of docility and gentleness, there's
Uh
a
huh.
train of thought that docility can be bred in, or there's that docility can be managed in. For example, you maybe see some operations that have like a very intensive calf gentling program, where
Uh
they're
huh.
desensitizing and breaking the cattle down, basically,
Hmm.
which is different than naturally gentle.
Right.
So
Right.
in your assessment, would you say the JT White cattle were naturally gentle, or did they become gentle just through this repetition of getting hand fed every day, or how do you think that all worked?
I think no question about it that it was both nature and
Mhm.
nurture. But
Mhm.
I think that with him, his situation was by the time I came along, because he'd been raising them for 50 years, that there wasn't, he was, like I say, his litmus test is you go out there and anybody, stranger, he could
Mhm.
take you out there and
Mhm. Yeah.
Rachel, would you scratch that
Yeah.
cow?
Yeah.
And if she flinched, she was gone.
Mhm.
And so that was how that came about. But I will say that, let me say this. There was obviously some genetic part of this because a lot of the cattle that John Jeffcoat had that were from JT White 449. A lot of those cattle were very naturally gentle.
Mhm.
Okay.
Mhm.
And he had a lot of sugar pedigrees, and the sugar cattle typically were not known to be, and
Right.
I didn't ever own any, but they typically, I know your family had some,
Yeah.
and all, they weren't typically noted to be real gentle because of the
Right.
environment that they were raised in.
Mhm.
And so he made that work. And so I don't know. I will say this in my current observation of raising cattle, gentle mamas have a higher percentage of creating gentle calves. Simply, yes, there's genetics, but it's by their nature.
Mhm.
Uh, for example, I can walk out here right now. I've got cows here at the house that when they calve, they're naturally curious, come up to me all the time. They're not overly protective or anything like that. Well, that calf sees that, so therefore he develops a trust. He or she develops a trust, and so it's easier. Now, if that cow is standoffish, then it's easier for that calf to be standoffish. Then again, there's some that transcend that. Mama may stand off, and that calf may come right up, and as soon as he or she starts getting positive affirmation, I rub the roof of their mouth and I gently pull their ears because this relieves stress. Because see, a cow can't scratch the top of their mouth, okay, but you can, and so they'll kind of mouth and maul your hand and your finger as you're scratching the roof of their mouth. Then they'll pull back, and then they'll come back and want to do it again, and so it's just part of a process of it's, but I think it's both, and I couldn't give you a clue as to what percentage effect, how much. It's 80% one, 20% the other. I don't know. I just think it's both. And then there's some cows that I've bred 4 years in a row. 3 of those years, those calves to the same bull, and 3 of those calves are absolutely just pests, and then one of them's a little nervous, and I have no idea how or why that happens that way.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that really answered your question or not, but that's
No,
just my experience.
definitely did.
And
So I want to jump into kind of the next topic right now, which is F1s. And we've talked a little bit about F1s, but God, when you said that you remember as a little boy, you just saw all this tiger stripes in the pasture, and you just said that, I want that. I think so many people can relate to that because I know I myself, I love purebred Brahman, but I probably love a pretty tiger stripe just as much. There is something about that, just that cross, or even, a Brahman Angus cross. But for you, you also are breeding Brahman Shorthorn crosses, which are phenomenal. Can you just talk us through, what does your crossbreeding program look like? What breeds are you using? Maybe how it's changed through the years?
Well, I'm going to tell you that I'm an experimenter. Okay. And this goes back to, of course, back to the JT White Bull on Hereford cows. So my dad retained all of those heifers and made cows out of them in his herd. And when we initially started breeding those cattle, this would have been mid-70s, I guess, when those heifers started really getting into the herd. We used a red limousine bull because that was the thing then, okay, and raised some tremendous calves. Of course, limousine cattle had just been, Simmental limousine had just been introduced, in the 70s, really in a real strong way. And what we loved about them is those calves, those limousine limousine calves or limousine sired calves out of an F1 cow. Those calves looked like a stinking jersey when they were born. It was terrible. I mean, it was like, in fact, when those calves started hitting the ground, my dad said, "This has been a wreck." But what happened was they were very small birth weight, yet grew rapidly. And by the time those calves were 4 or 5 months old, it was like, wow. And they had nice little quarter horse hips on them and all that, and they weren't double muscled, but they had heavy hips. They didn't have the depth of body, and I think maybe that was some of the issues that came along after that, as far as the red limousine goes. But so I saw crossbreeding early on, and for a purpose. Then we went to black bulls and Hereford bulls, and on those F1 cows. I have bred, and I'm on record to say this, I have bred Brahman cows to the following bulls: Longhorn, Guernsey, Holstein, Shorthorn, Horned Hereford, Red Angus, Polled Hereford.
Wow.
I don't think I've bred any just Charolais yet, just simply because I don't have an access to Charolais bull. But I've had calves out of all of those. And here again, I would say overall, and I don't want to make anybody mad, but I would say the best set of calves I ever raised overall were out of Red Angus bulls and Brahman cows.
Brandon is going to love that because we just invested in a Red Angus bull.
Well, I'll tell you, you will not be disappointed. And then secondly, but the issue is this: I'm breeding for a market. I can more readily market. I mean, you got to play to your strengths. So it's much easier to market a F1 Tiger Stripe or an F1 Black Angus than it is an F1 Red Angus at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying I think that may shift.
Mm-hmm.
And the same thing with a Shorthorn.
Mm-hmm.
Shorthorn is not as generally accepted. Therefore, another aspect of this you have to think about, okay, so since I'm putting 10, 12 heifers into my herd every year, okay, well, you've got some 6 and 7 and 8-year-old cows that are still in the prime of their productive life there. And so you've got them out running in the pasture. If they're bred to a Hereford or even an Angus bull, and you wean the calf off of them in October and you sell them at San Saba or someplace at a special sale as a 6 or 7-year-old viable registered Brahman cow with an F1 calf in her, she's a more marketable animal with either a tiger stripe or a black calf in her than she is at this point with a Red Angus, Shorthorn, or anything else.
Mm-hmm.
And I bred the Guernsey bull twice to specifically produce embryo recip heifers.
Mm-hmm.
And the steers were a trip, but the heifers worked out really well. And so it was an experiment. And I have, I did, obviously I didn't stay down that road, but I tried it 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
Polled Hereford and Shorthorn are my current bulls of choice, and I don't see that changing at this point. I have a good I have a waiting list on my tiger stripe heifers. One man buys them all. And then I've been fortunate enough to market my F1 Shorthorn heifers recently very well. And so I don't think that's a problem. But the F1 Red Angus is an outstanding animal. Steers, oh my gosh. I mean, big and stout, and I mean, just fantastic. And side note on that, and you can tell Brandon this, at the grand champion pen, the number one pen for the Brahman Bucks, first place at Lou Thompson's sale in last September, our first Brahman Bucks event, was a set of either 5 or 6 golden certified Red Angus bred back to medium to heavy bred to Red Angus bull. And I think those heifers brought either 3250 or 3450 at that sale. And they went to the man in South Dakota.
Mm-hmm. Well,
Of course, I'm anxious to see how that went now.
Yeah, when we put in our, like when we put it out there that we had bought into this Red Angus bull, our phone just started ringing. Just to be honest, it was a lot of people from, Oklahoma, Kansas area that were calling and asking, and I thought that was really exciting. Which actually,
well, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that kind of leads me to my next question for you is, you were raising F1s out in West Texas, which I consider a little different, obviously, than Bowling, Texas. Where do you see as the target area for people to be raising F1s?
Well, and this kind of goes into the plan we were talking about. Just imagine a geographic area, I-35, east of I-35, south of I-40. So that would take you from Laredo, Texas to Oklahoma City, where you intersect with I-40, and then I-40 continues east all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. And that's a heat and humidity area, high density cow numbers, and a place that in years past, Brahman and Brahman influenced cattle had a pretty good presence in. As I travel, even in East Texas today, I see lots of short-eared cows in the pasture and very few Brahman cross cows in the pasture as a whole. There's still places where there's lots of good F1 or Brahman cross cows, don't get me wrong. But I see that the value of an F1 female, and Rachel, I'm not talking about an F1 has to be tiger stripe, have to be black, have to be shorthorn, have to be Red Angus. Why can't a cowman in Tennessee, let's just use that for example, or South Arkansas, who has runs a cow to every 1 or 2 acres, and using short-eared cows of all kinds, red ring eyes, black white face, black Red Angus, just cows with short ears, Boss Taurus cows. Why can't we as Brahman breeders impress on those particular breeders that if you would use a 70-pound birth weight or less, thick, gentle Brahman bull, breed that to those cows, retain those heifer calves, out of there and gradually work those into your herd. Maybe if you got 500 cows, you put 100 head with Brahman bulls.
Mm-hmm.
And gradually work those cows into your herd and breed those for the most part at this point in time to black Angus bulls, because black is beautiful. Everybody wants a black calf.
Mm-hmm.
And so instead of weaning a 500-pound black calf, black-hided calf, black-haired calf out of these short-eared cows that may not all be black, but the calves will turn out black, that weighs 500 pounds, let's wean one out of them that weighs 575 pounds,
Mm-hmm.
because it's an F1 cow.
Mm-hmm.
Using the cow, they don't have to reinvent the wheel. All they have to do is invest in a couple of bulls that fit the category and move into that and start weaning and raising bigger calves. There is data for the last 70 years on the improved weaning weights of F1 raised calves over non-F1 calves. That data's been done by University of Florida, LSU, Mississippi State, A&M, OSU, and probably other ones too.
Mm-hmm.
That data needs to be, it's still the same thing. Heterosis and hybrid vigor hasn't changed. It's still there.
Right.
And so that is where I see the future of F1s or future of Brahmans, because you got to have Brahman to get F1. That's where I see our future is, if we have any hopes to want to expand the footprint of the Brahman breed in the areas where it can go. Now, this same thing could apply in the Southwest, but the issue is density of cattle and all that. So it's let's shoot our best shot where where the most doves are flying,
Right, right.
and that's going to be in the southeastern United States. Something Jim Reeves told me one time that fascinated me. I was on an oil field trip from Abilene to Houston, and it was on Tuesday, which was sale day at the Bryan Sale Barn, Bryan, Texas. And so I did not have to be in Houston until Wednesday morning. So I stopped by the Bryan Sale Barn. This would have been late 90s, early 2000s. I thought I'll just walk in there. Hadn't been to the Bryan Sale Barn ever. Walk on the catwalk, and I'll see some really good crossbred Brahman cattle there. I mean, half-blood steers, half-blood heifers, all this kind of the blacks, brindles. Just kind of feed my need to see eared cattle.
Mm-hmm.
I was shocked. There were more Longhorn influenced cattle under that shed that day at that sale than there were Brahman influenced.
That's sad.
And I was like, why is this? So a week or so later, I get Jim on the phone. And when he was executive director of ABB, I said, explain that to me. And he said something exceedingly profound. He said, fire ants. I said, fire ants. He said, yeah, fire ants. Okay. You think about ticks. Cattle, one of the reasons that Brahman cattle were originally brought in was for insect resistance and fever ticks. Okay. Which is true. Okay. And so those cattle were brought in. Now, all the hybrid vigor and all that other stuff, that came about. We discovered all that later on. But originally it was to fix a problem, which was insects and survivability where there were insects. When the fire ants, and fire ants aren't native to Texas, but when the fire ants started moving in through imports of sod or whatever happened, and they started working their way from the Gulf Coast north and east, when those ticks hit the ground off those short-haired cows, those fire ants eat those ticks, and they don't proliferate. Therefore, the need, strictly from a tick standpoint or an insect standpoint, now there's flies and there's all other things, but I'm talking about from ticks. So a lot of cows that, say, if you had a ranch between Navasota and Bryan, Texas, in the 1970s or 60s or 70s, you had to have Brahman influenced cattle in order to be able to survive the ticks and everything else that goes with that.
Mm-hmm.
When the fire ants came, you eliminated one of the reasons. Now, I don't know if that's scientific or not, but I'll give you a personal example on my own ranch in Coleman County. I started out with Hereford cows there. I'd spray those cows 3 times a year.
Mm-hmm.
I finally got tired of that and sold those cattle to Jim Theek at Mayfair Ranch and went the other way, put Brahman cows and Hereford bulls.
Mm-hmm.
I have fire ants. Didn't have it when I first bought that ranch in the early 90s. I've got fire ants everywhere, and I have very few ticks. And I don't spray or anything. So there may be something to that theory. Now, that doesn't change the fact of hybrid vigor, heterosis, all the other things. But
Mosquitoes.
it did open
Mosquitoes. Do the fire ants
and
mosquitoes?
mosquitoes. You're right. You're right.
Yeah.
And you have to understand, I'm a drylander. We get
Oh.
mosquitoes maybe once every 10 years, but but that is one aspect. So what it did is it opened the door for maybe some long-haired, shorter-eared cattle to be put in places that typically would have always been Brahman cross.
Mm-hmm.
So we've assumed that we had a market share as a breed or an association, and as a breed, and we have let that go. We still have outstanding marketing traits. Joe Pascal was talking about the whole fescue poisoning aspect of it, and I don't know what all that is. You're more knowledgeable of that than I am, Rachel, about the nitrates or whatever that is. But anyway, that Brahman and Brahman cross cattle have a greater immunity to that than non-Brahman cross.
Mm-hmm.
And the southeastern United States has those issues.
Mm-hmm.
And so anyway, I don't know. I got down a different bunny trail there, but
that's a really interesting way to think about it. So, well, we have been at it for nearly an hour, but I still have one more question, if you don't mind. One more kind of topic I'd like to talk about.
Yes, ma'am.
And that is kind of advice for new breeders. And because, like you said, you would be, what would you say you're a first generation or a second generation Brahman breeder?
Oh, I would consider my dad. My dad was the catalyst, so I guess I'd be second, but he never actually owned any Brahman cattle, but he facilitated, encouraged, did everything he possibly could for me to be able to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And my dad's been dead since 1989, and he would be exceedingly pleased and excited, and some of the words that come out of my mouth are the words that came out of his mouth. I heard growing up about Brahman cattle and Brahman influence cattle and the values of F1s. But if I was going to start a business today, and once again, I want to say something. You and Brandon have done such an excellent job of being so vertically integrated, cross integrated in so many different areas, because you've analyzed markets first. You had a passion to do what you want to do, but you've analyzed, okay, where can I take my passion and how can I fit that into the marketplace and make it that a profit center? And y'all have done that, and I applaud you for that and encourage you to continue in that pursuit the way you have. Jennifer and I feel very strongly about, we want our ceiling to be the next generation's floor. And we believe that for our children and our grandchildren. And I think that as cattlemen, we need to have that perspective as one generation handing off to the next generation. And so I think that is so terribly important. But if I'm going to get into the Brahman business, I'm going to get into the cattle business in any way, okay? What is my passion? And then what is my market? So I want to raise Brahman cattle. Okay, so I live in West Central Texas. So we have a lot of short-eared cattle that could be bred to Brahman bulls and could create F1 calves that have a value. Those F1 females have a superior value as far as their productivity. So how do I go about that? Well, the first thing I do is say, okay, I'm going to sell bulls to people that've got 1,200-pound Black Angus cows, just to say that. So I need to have a pretty moderate to small birth weight bull. I need to be over the top gentle. And whatever genetic trend or environmental trend I need to have as far as that is concerned, then I need to create gentle animals, because I can sell a gentle one all day long. I can sell but it's more difficult to sell one that's not gentle, that may even be better quality, so to speak. But if they're a little silly, it just doesn't work. And so over the top gentleness, thickness, now I'm to the point of the pole side of it is very important to me, simply for labor and stress and cost is very important. And then also, and you guys are doing a great job, and many others are. I'm a little slow to the dance on it, but I get it, and I will embrace it more. But the EPDs for carcass performance and things like that, these are all the things I would strive to do if I was going to get in the Brahman business. Now, if I wanted to be in the show Brahman business, then I would probably look at different criterion. But if I was just going to raise Brahman cattle to sell as my end market, that's what I would do. And that's, I guess that'd be my advice.
Well, that's some great advice. Really, that's wonderful advice. It has been a lot of fun visiting. Is there anything we missed? I mean, I know we could talk for hours, but
Days. We could talk for days.
Yeah.
Well, I see this. I've been a member of associations since '87. I've seen a lot of people come and go, and I've seen a lot of people jump in, jump out, spend a lot of money on genetics, spend a lot of money chasing banners and all that stuff. But Brahman cattle are passionate cattle, and they can only be raised by passionate people. Because if you don't have the passion for them, you won't stay with it.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be my advice. And so if this is truly your passion and not just a passing fancy, then you can have a future in the Brahman business. But if it's just because they're kind of cute and floppy and all that, and that's fine, and I obviously drawn to that myself, but you've got to have a passion to want to do it. Heck, you have to have a passion to want to ranch in general.
Mm-hmm.
I don't care if it's raising Brahmins or raising certified Angus Wagyu. It doesn't make any difference. You better have a passion to want to be in it, and don't settle for less than your passion. And that's true in any aspect of life, I guess, but especially in the agricultural business, because it is a high investment and virtually kind of low return kind of business. So you better have the resolve to stay with it.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was great advice. I honestly can't think of a better way to wrap up, because that's such solid advice for anybody getting into ranching. Yeah. Well, I want to thank you for your time. I know you're very busy, and I want to thank you for sharing this information and just sharing just the glimpse into your history, and then also the white history, and just some great advice. This has been one of my favorite interviews, and I know our team I know that our listeners are really going to love it too. So now,
I hope something was said that was beneficial.
Just a quick kind of wrap up. If someone were wanting to get some of your F1 genetics, kind of just wrap it up by telling people where you market your F1s, or they can reach out to you to get some of those good F1 genetics.
Well, honestly, to be real frank with you, probably Facebook, just Brand Jones on Facebook. And I'm on several Brahman sites, I think about 10 or 11 of them, and a couple of just regular cows. So I'm actually on the Shorthorn side, and I'm actually on the and I forgot to mention, I've used a British White Bull. I'm on British White sites, and I actually like those cattle. The color predictability is a little off there, but anyway, just find me on Facebook, Brand Jones, and reach out to me. And I usually post something on there that has something to do with F1s or grandkids. And so F1s, Brahmins are grandkids, so it's pretty easy to find.
Yes. Well, thank you again. Thank you so much for sharing that expertise with us, and to our listeners, thanks again for listening. We hope you have a great day, and we hope you enjoyed this episode of Over the Hump. Hey guys, we hope that you're enjoying the Over the Hump podcast. We've had so many great reviews and great feedback from this podcast, and we've had several people asking how they can support it. So we are proud to announce that we've created the Over the Hump fan club, where you can join and sign up on a yearly basis to help support this podcast and get some really cool merch as well. We have 3 different levels, ranging from $40 a year to $250 a year. And at each level, you get some really cool different benefits and different free gifts. For example, at our Trailblazer level, you get a free copy of my really awesome Modern Brahmin coffee table book, which is a 160-page coffee table book featuring the gorgeous photography of Carlos Guizora from Mexico, along with Brahmin history written by me. And then our Supreme Stockman level, which is $250 a year, includes that plus free access to the Brahman Academy for 1 year. And at our Trailblazer and Supreme Stockman levels, you also get a discount to use in the BRC online store, which you can use for anything that's in the store, including semen, AI certificates, show cattle camp, event registrations, and more. So this is a really great opportunity, especially if you purchase a lot of semen or AI certificates from us. You can join the fan club and get some great discounts to use throughout the whole year. So if you like this podcast and want to help support it, you can sign up for the Over the Hump fan club at shopbrcutrer.com. That's shopbrcutrer.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you are enjoying it.
You've been listening to the Over the Hump podcast. Our passion is Brahman cattle, and it runs deep. And this show is about its rich history, industry trends, and stories that define the American Brahman. We hope you've enjoyed the show. If you did, make sure to like, rate, review, and subscribe. We'll be back soon. But in the meantime, find us on Instagram and Facebook at BR Cottrare. See you next time on the Over the Hump podcast.